So to understand that, we define something, an important concept here. It's called the marginal product. The marginal, if Jack hires one more worker, his output rises by the marginal product of labor. The marginal product of labor. What is the marginal product? Is the marginal product of any input. The marginal product of any input is the increase in output arising from an additional unit of that input, holding all other inputs constant. So if we notate delta as represent a change in a variable, so and therefore delta Q represents the change in output, and delta L represents the change in labor. So the marginal product of labor, MPL, would be delta Q over delta L. Delta Q over delta L, the change in quantity of output over the change in input, which is here in our case labor, tell us about the increase in output arising from an additional unit of that input. So let's compute the marginal product of labor for Jack. Here we put again the data about labor and the corresponding quantity of output to each number of workers. So you can compute the marginal product of labor by dividing delta Q over delta L. Here the first worker produces 1,000 units or bushels of wheat. Delta Q is then 1,000, and the number of workers at the beginning is the change in work is 1. So 1,000 over 1 gives us an MPL of 1,000. If the worker number 2, produces 800 bushels of wheat. So the MPL becomes 800. Observe, notate that as we increase the number of workers, the marginal product of labor is decreasing. So let's see for the worker number 3. The worker number 3, he produces 600 bushels of wheat. So this makes an MPL of 600. The same thing, worker number 4 and worker number 5. So you see the worker number 5, his product, he could produce only 200 bushels of wheat. You see here the worker number 5 has a productivity lower than the productivity of the worker number 1. So MPL is actually the marginal product of labor is representing the productivity of each additional worker. And in general, the marginal product is representing the productivity of each additional unit of inputs. You see, the marginal product is decreasing as we increase the number of workers. This is why the production curve at first it rises strongly. Then as we increase the number of workers, it's getting more and more flat. The marginal product of labor equals actually the slope of the production function. Notice that MPL diminishes as L increases. This explains why the production function gets flatter as L increases. As I said, so the MPL is the slope of the production function. You see here, delta Q over delta L is actually the slope of this curve. See, the slope is at first it is 1000, then it is 800, then with the third worker it becomes 600, the fourth worker it is 400, and then the fifth worker it is 200. So the MPL representing here, it is the marginal product represents the slope of the production function. Why MPL is important? Recall one of the 10 principles: rational people think at the margin. You remember this principle: rational people think at the margin. What does that mean in this case? When Jack hires an extra worker, what's the thought that are in his mind when he thinks about hiring an extra worker? Here he is a rational individual. So I will show you here how this rational individual is thinking at the margin. He compares two things: the costs of hiring one extra worker and the cost of hiring one extra worker is the wage he pays to that worker. So he compares this cost to the revenue that is going to come from this extra worker. The revenue is represented by the output and how much output this extra worker is going to bring or to produce. This extra worker production is represented by his marginal product of labor. How much units of output this extra worker will produce. What is the participation of this extra worker in rising total output? So he compares these two things: the costs and the revenue of this extra worker. Comparing them helps Jack decide whether he would benefit from hiring the worker. So then he after comparing these two things, he will decide whether it is beneficial and profitable for him to hire this one more worker or not. So this is what does it mean rational people think at the margin. At the margin here is the one extra input. The one extra input. What are the costs of this one extra input, and what is the output from this extra input? Why MPL diminishes? So why the MPL is not constant, for example? Why the production function is not the slope of the production function is not constant? Why the level of the productivity of the worker number one is not the same as the productivity or the marginal product of the worker number 100? Why the worker number 100 produce less than the worker number 99, and the worker 99 produce less than the worker number 98. So there are reasons for this, of course. Jack's output rises by a smaller and smaller amount for each additional worker. So why? As Jack adds worker, the average worker has less land to work with and will be less productive. So in this case, in this farming example, the additional worker will have less land to work in. So because he has less land to work in compared to the worker number 1 or the worker number 2, obviously his productivity will be lower. In general, MPL diminishes as L rises, whether the fixed input is land or capital, equipment, machines, etc. So there is a principle called diminishing marginal product. The marginal product of an input declines as the quantity of the input increases, other things equal. So other things equal means nothing changes except the input we are talking about. So if other things equal, as the marginal product of any input, whether it is labor or capital or whatever, as we increase the number or the quantity of this input, always the production function, the production curve is going to flatten, and meaning that the marginal product of that input is decreasing as the quantity of that input, whether let it be land, equipment, worker, whatever, as the quantity of the input increases. So it is like a law here. So here, example 1, farmer Jack's costs. Farmer Jack must pay $1,000 per month for the land. So it is the rent of the land, $1,000, regardless of how much wheat he grows. The market wage for a farm worker is $2,000 per month. So farmer Jack's costs are related to how much wheat he produces. So let's compute the costs of Mr. Jack. The cost of the land is fixed here. It does not vary according to the output, whether the output is 0 or 3,000. The cost is always 1,000, as you see. The cost of labor. The cost of labor, how do you think it will vary? Of course it varies. As the number of workers increases, the cost of labor is going to increase because we have to pay more and more wages. So here the cost of labor increases as, unlike the cost of the land, the cost of labor varies according to the level of output. Okay, so here we have the cost of land that does not change according to the change in the output. It is always $1,000, but the cost of labor, it changes according to the change in the level of output. Well, if the farmer produces 1,000 bushels of wheat, the cost is $2,000. But if he wants to produce 2,800 bushels of wheat, the cost of labor becomes 8,000. So it does not change. It does change with respect to the quantity of output. So here we have a cost of land that do not change with the quantity of output. We call this cost fixed cost. And we have here a cost of labor that changes with the quantity of production. We call this cost a variable cost. And here we have total cost. Total cost, of course, it is the sum of all costs here. Cost of land and cost of labor. So if we try to draw the total cost curve, here we put in this, we draw in this plan of total costs and quantity of output with the curve of total cost. It has this shape. Here in the slides we are going to define an important an important concept in costs, which is the marginal cost. This concept of cost that is marginal cost will follow us in the coming chapters. It is an important concept. What do you mean by marginal cost? The marginal cost, notated MC, is the increase in total cost from producing one more unit. So it is delta total cost over delta Q. So it is the change in the costs arising from one additional unit of output. Indeed, each unit of output has its own costs. The units produced by a firm do not have actually the same costs. Each unit has its own cost, and each unit's own cost is called the marginal cost, and it is calculated by dividing the change in total cost over the change in total output. So we come back to our example, and we try to compute this marginal cost. Here we have the first column, we have different levels of output, and the second column we have total cost related to each level of output. So marginal cost is delta total cost over delta Q. So here if we from 0 to 1000 units of bushels of wheat, delta total costs is 2000 and delta Q is 1000. So 2000 divided by 1000, it gives $2. This means that for the first 1000 units of the first 1000 bushels of wheat, the marginal cost of each bushel is $2. The cost of each unit is $2. Now, if once the production is increased by 800 bushels of wheat, so the total cost passes from 3,000 to 5,000. So the change in total cost is $2,000. The number of bushels of wheat passes from 1,000 to 1,800. So the change in total output is 800. Dividing 2000 by 800, we get $2 times 0.5. So here, these 800 bushels of wheat, each bushel has a marginal cost of, or cost of $2.5. We do the same for each level of production, and we compute the marginal costs. Okay, I hope it is clear. So the marginal cost curve. Here we are going to work with curves a lot. So for each data we have on a table, we will draw this data on a plan. Marginal costs usually rises as Q rises. So we'll see it's not usually rises, actually it is usually rises, but later in the coming slides we'll see that at the beginning it falls, but then it rises. Okay, so for now let's take it as it is written here. MC rises as Q rises. Q the level of output, as in this example. So we will have a shape if we put this data here, MC with respect to different levels of production and output, here in the x-axis Q level of production, and in the y-axis cost of production, we get a curve that have this form. So why MC is important? Why the marginal cost is important? Here still I remind that principle that rational people think at the margin. So at the margin, and here, so the marginal cost is explaining or explains this principle. Farmer Jack is rational and wants to maximize his profit. To increase profit, should he produce more or less wheat? So Mr. Jack always thinks to maximize or to increase more his profits. And at each level of he reaches of output, he always wonders, shall I produce more? Shall I produce less? Shall I produce one more unit or not? Obviously, he will compare. If he will compare, he will always make this comparison. What is the revenue or the output he gets from this one? What is the output or what is the revenue he gets from this output? And what is the cost of this additional unit of output? The cost of this additional unit of output is actually the marginal cost of that additional unit of output. It is the marginal cost of that unit. To find the answer, Farmer Jack needs to think at the margin, always think at the margin. If the cost of additional wheat is less than the revenue he would get from selling it, then Jack's profit rise if he produce more. Why? Because the cost of that additional unit, which is MC, is less than the revenue he would get from selling it in the market. So producing one more unit would clearly increase his total profit. So he will go for it. He will produce one more unit. and of course paying the costs, but it doesn't matter. The costs are still less than the revenue he can get from the selling that unit of output. Okay, if it is the opposite, if the cost of that additional unit of output, that additional bushel of wheat, is higher than the revenue he can get from selling that bushel of wheat, so here he compares the costs are higher than the revenue, he will find that his profit will actually decrease instead of increasing. So he's rational. He doesn't like to find his profits falling. He wants his profits to produce at the highest profit possible. So he will not produce that one additional unit of bushel of wheat. So here, how irrational, what does it mean irrational? Individual think at the margin. He always compares the cost of an additional unit of production to the revenue that comes from that additional unit. Okay, finishing with the marginal cost, here we come back to the definitions and we define the fixed and variable costs. We talked about this in the previous slides. The fixed costs, FC, are the costs that do not vary with the quantity of output produced. The example we have seen is that the cost of the land. The cost of the land for Jack does not change whatever the level of output is. So we call such type of costs fixed costs. Here for Farmer Jack, FC is $1,000 for his land. Other examples of fixed costs, example cost of equipment, loan payment, or rent. You pay your rent whether your factory is producing and or not. The variable costs instead are the costs that vary with the level of production. We have seen in the example of Farmer Jack, we see the variable cost is the wages he pays to the workers. As the number of workers increase because Farmer Jack wants to produce more bushels of wheat, he would pay more wages to workers. So this total wages to workers is varying according to the quantity produced. So we call such type of costs variable costs. Other examples, cost of materials, resources, etc. So total cost is always equal to fixed costs plus variable costs. Example 2, here in working on another example 2, our second example is more general, applies to any type of firm producing any good with any types of inputs. So here we will generalize. Here we have a data of different levels of output, Q, and the fixed costs should be fixed whatever the level of output is. So here in this example, the fixed cost is $100. If we draw the curve of fixed costs, obviously it will be a straight line, horizontal line. Whatever the level of production, these costs are always fixed for each for the production. The variable costs here, we have a data of variable costs. You see as the number of, as the quantity units increase, the variable costs increase. So they vary with respect to Q. And we draw this curve, we get this form. This form in orange color. Total output is the sum of both. Drawing the total cost gives us this curve in green color. You see this curve in green color will be the sum of fixed costs plus variable costs. So it is variable cost plus fixed costs give us total costs. Here the marginal cost. This example is more general, so we'll see the typical form of the marginal cost curve. So here we have output, total costs, and the marginal cost is the change in total cost over the change in quantities. So we get the data of the marginal cost. So you see at the beginning the marginal cost for the first unit, the marginal cost 70. Then the second unit marginal cost is 50. And then it is 40. So at the beginning the marginal cost is decreasing. You see, it is decreasing from 70 to 40. Then from the third unit produced, the marginal cost rises again from 40 to 50, and then the fourth unit, it rises from 50 to 70, and so on. So you see at the beginning, for the first units produced, the marginal cost is decreasing. Then after certain level of production, the marginal cost rises again. So this gives us the typical marginal cost curve. Here costs, marginal costs, and here output Q. At the beginning it is decreasing, then it attains certain minimum, and then it rises again. So this is a typical form of the marginal cost curve for any firm.